Morning, Chair.
Yes.
Chair, for today, the ESCOM course of evidence is suspended temporarily. It will resume tomorrow. And evidence will be led by Ms. Abashi in relation to the evidence of Mr. Trevor Manuel. And then that will be followed by the evidence of General Siphiwe Nyanda, who will be led by Ms. Senate.
Thank you.
Morning, Chair.
Good morning, Mr. Bashir.
Morning, Mr. Manuel. Chairman, the Commission will this morning hear the evidence of Mr. Trevor Manuel and retired General Siphiwe Nyanda. With your leave, it might be convenient and appropriate for Mr. Trevor, who represents Mr. Manuel, to place himself on record and to introduce his team. Thank you, Chair.
Yes.
May it please you, Chair. I learned friend of Gupta, and I instructed by Ms. Manuel to appear for the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Trevor.
Thank you, Chair. For your ease of reference, Chair, and also for the ease of reference of the witness, the bundle today consists of 2 volumes, which are marked V1 and V2, but they're in one file, Chairman. We ask you to admit them as exhibits V1 and V2. If you open the file, Chairman.
I have before that, so this will be...
So it's exhibit V for Valerie. And inside we have divided the file, Chairman, between the evidence of Mr. Manuel, which comes under V1,
Yes.
and the evidence of General Nyanda, which has been placed under the section marked V2.
Thank you very much.
The structure of today's evidence, Chairman, will be as follows. First, we are going to just address you very briefly on the relevance of Mr. Manuel's evidence to the Commission's terms of reference, followed by, Chairman, just a housekeeping issue I'd like to call it, which is the furnishing of the Rule 3.3 notices to Mr. Mbadula, just to give you a sense of what has transpired in that regard, and to give you a level of comfort around that issue.
Yes.
And then after that, we will really go into what I call the merits.
Okay.
If I might start with the relevance of Mr.
Yes.
Manuel's evidence, Chairman. Both terms of reference 1.1 and 1.3 are relevant to what Mr. Manuel has to tell us today. The more specific one really is term of reference 1.3, which reads as follows, just for the record, Chairman. It asks us to investigate in the context of state capture, fraud and corruption, whether the appointment of any member of the National Executive, functionary and or office bearer was disclosed to the Gupta family or any other unauthorized person before such appointments were formally made and or announced, and if so, whether the President or any member of the National Executive is responsible for such.
Yes.
Chairman, in context, therefore, various issues will be explored with Mr. Manuel. He is a South African who has been South Africa's longest serving Minister of Finance. But he also has insights, Chairman, into aspects of the efficacy of laws, such as the PFMA, by way of example, and policies of government that inform the terms of reference of this Commission. In this regard, his views will be sought on the concept of state capture, as defined, among others, by the two American experts who gave evidence before this commission in August and September last year. Mr. Manuel will primarily deal with the specific topic of the statement of Mr. Mbalula at the August 2011 ANC-NEC meeting regarding the appointment, or how Mr. Mbalula got to know that he was to be appointed as Minister of Sport and Recreation. In this regard, of course, the affidavit that has been deposed by Mr. Manuel on the 11th of October 2018 is relevant. The Commission did, Chairman, after reading that particular affidavit, ask Mr. Manuel to share his insights on appointments and dismissals of cabinet members, simply to dig into his institutional knowledge of those matters, Chairman. He has deposed to an affidavit, which is the supplementary affidavit that's annexed to the papers, and in that he deals with those aspects. We believe, Chairman, that that particular part of his evidence will inform or may inform some of the recommendations that you may wish to consider as you finalize this process.
Yes.
For the sake of completeness, Chairman, it's important to point out that Mr. Mbalula and Mr. Atul Gupta are implicated parties with regards to Mr. Manuel's evidence. Both were furnished with Rule 33 notices, Chairman, notifying them that they're implicated parties. Mr. Mbalula's was emailed to him on the 31st of October 2018. As you'll appreciate, Chairman, the full statement of Mr. Manuel was annexed to that notice. In fact, in the case of Mr. Mbalula, a copy of the rules and a copy of the terms of reference was also annexed just for his ease of reference. Mr. Atul Gupta has not responded to that notice. Rather, his brother Ajay Gupta sought to respond by way of a Rule 34 application, as the Chairman is aware. This application was opposed by Mr. Manuel, and in the ruling you gave on the 13th of September, you dealt with the subject matter of why the Guptas are, at this point in time, not entitled to an audience before you until such time as they essentially submit to the jurisdiction of this commission. Now, really just paraphrasing, but you made a ruling, Chairman, and for that reason, the Rule 3.4 application was unsuccessful. With your leave, however, Chairman, and also in terms of our rules, the allegations made by Mr. Ajay Gupta in that Rule 3.4 application will be put to Mr. Manuel for the record, much as Mr. Manuel did respond to them when he opposed the Rule 3.4 application. He's aware that we will put them because we've explained that in terms of our rules, when we do have a version, we place that version before the witness who is currently taking the stand.
You haven't said whether Mr. Mbalula did acknowledge receipt of the Rule 3.3 notice and whether he has reacted in any way to that notice.
That's the next area that I touch on right now, Chairman.
Okay.
To structure my thoughts, I made notes for myself.
Okay.
Because it raises a little bit of a dispute, and I believe we must give him the benefit of the doubt because of the issue he raises. Mr. Mbalula was furnished with that by email, Rule 3.3 notice. He's also been given notice of today's proceedings. As recently as the 14th of February, Chairman, Mr. Mbalula was reminded that he had not responded to the Rule 3.3 notice, and he was requested to present a version to the Commission on or before Friday, the 22nd of February. On the 22nd of February, Chairman, the Commission received correspondence from Mr. Mbalula in which he stated that he had not been furnished with the October 2018 statement of Mr. Manuel, but instead had been furnished with a supplementary statement of February this year. What the Commission then did was we immediately wrote back to him and indicated when we had sent the original 3-3 notice to him, and we asked him to please, within the shortest period of time, furnish us with a version. We have yet to receive that version from Mr. Mbalula. So essentially, Chairman, what we have on file, and I have a small file that we have prepared, should you wish to look at it at your leisure, is a file that indicates that an email was sent by our attorney of record to Mr. Mbalula in serving the Rule 3-3 notice. The email was delivered, Chairman. However, no acknowledgement of the email or the Rule 3-3 notice was received from Mr. Mbalula. The email address that was used is the same email address we have used consistently, Chairman. So by way of example, when he responded to the Commission's letter of the 14th of February this year, the email that had been sent to him about giving the Commission a version was exactly the same email address that was used when the Rule 3-3 notice was sent to him on the 31st of October last year. However, Chairman, I think he ought to be given the benefit of the doubt regarding when he received the Rule 3-3 notice. What we can be sure of is that he knows of today's proceedings. He has made public statements in which he has said he is only too happy to assist this Commission, and he will appear before this Commission when called upon to do so. So in that regard, Chairman, I don't think there will be any particular difficulty in obtaining a version from Mr. Mbalula and in him appearing before this Commission as and when it is appropriate for him to do so.
Well, if the Rule 3-3 notice was sent by email, somebody should have made sure that if no acknowledgement was received from him by a certain time, further steps were taken to make sure we have got proof, the Commission has got proof that he was served with the Rule 3-3 notice. If he was served, if the Rule 3-3 notice was sent to him in September last year, that's a long time ago. And it shouldn't be that we only hear in February that he says he never received. I think measures must be put in place to make sure that within a certain period of time after a Rule 3-3 notice has been sent to an implicated person by email, that if no acknowledgement is received, other steps must be taken to make sure that the Rule 3-3 notice is served in a manner that will give us proof of service. You know, technology is good and it's very helpful, but sometimes it creates problems when people deny having received something when there is a dispute. So I think urgent measures must be taken, either that the Rule 3-3 notice be served afresh in circumstances where there will be proof furnished to the Commission that he has been served, or if it's emailed again, it must be on the understanding that he agrees to immediately send confirmation that he has received it. And I think this should apply to everyone else. So the legal team should look at everyone else who has been served or sent in by email the Rule 3-3 notice, who has not responded or acknowledged receipt, and try and take measures to make sure that they have got, you have got proof that they have received it, because we don't want disputes about whether people have received these notices or not. Okay, no, that's all right. We will proceed. Those measures must just be taken.
Thank you, Chairman. We will do so.
Yeah.
Chairman, for what it's worth, of course, in the media, Mr. Manuel's evidence has been all over the papers since at least October last year. So I would like to think that Mr. Mbalula is aware of the essence of what Mr. Manuel will be saying today. But I think that he
Yes.
also will
Yeah.
be prepared to come to the Commission. He has indicated as much and
Yeah.
assist the Commission. It's really just a timing issue, Chairman.
Yeah.
But I think he will, I'd like to think he will be here.
Well, I must just say, in line with what I've been saying to the legal team of late, steps must be taken to make sure that all the people who are implicated in matters relating to dismissals and appointments, and in regard to most of the witnesses who have given evidence, they must now be brought to the Commission to give their version. So one, we must get their versions in writing first. Two, they have got to appear. And if they are not volunteering to appear, then we must use the processes that are at our disposal to compel them to appear. We don't have a lot of time to do this work. We have got to move with speed. So, but I know that at least in terms of the media, there are a number who keep on saying they are waiting for the Commission to invite them. But people shouldn't wait for the Commission to invite them. If they want to make a contribution, they should make communication with the Commission and say, I would like to come and deal with this. This is what I know. I would like to come in and deal with this or make a statement. But from our side, the Commission mustn't delay anymore now. We need to make sure that we wrap up all the evidence, particularly relating to dismissals and appointments and evidence of witnesses that we have had so far.
Thank you, Chairman. I must say we do struggle a little with some witnesses,
Yes.
but we'll follow the advice
Yeah.
you're giving, and I trust the public out there is also understanding you very
Yes,
clearly as to
yes,
how we are
yes.
going to deal with
Yeah.
witnesses who are reluctant
Yeah.
to work within our time
Yes,
frames and
yeah.
prefer to tell us about their time frames.
Yeah, no, we have been trying to accommodate witnesses where we can, but we have got to draw a line. We don't have a lot of time to do this work. This Commission is not going to finish its work within time if we are going to all the time wait for dates that suit witnesses. We'll have to be quite firm. I hope everyone will give priority to the work of the Commission because there is a time within which we must finish this work. Okay.
Chairman, we've asked Mr. Mbalula to respond to our letter of the 21st of February last week within 5 days and give us a version. I think that the enforcement tools that you refer to may have to kick in if we do not have
Yeah.
a version from him latest tomorrow evening, first thing Monday morning.
Yes, they may have to kick in, and not only in regard to him. There are others also who are supposed to have responded to either requests that have been made to them or to correspondence that has been sent to them who have not done so. So we'll have to use those powers. We can't be delayed for too long because of people who might not really be giving the work of the Commission priority. I accept that in some cases people have got legitimate schedule challenges and they would definitely like to help the Commission and they would like to give it priority. But we'll look at those. But one can't avoid the impression that there are some who are not giving the work of the Commission the priority that it deserves.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, I believe it's appropriate now for the witness to be sworn in. He prefers to take an affirmation.
Okay, just administer the affirmation.
Trevor and Manuel. any objection with making the prescribed affirmation?
I have no objection.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, I truly affirm.
I so affirm.
Thank you very much. Before you start, Mr. Bashe, Mr. Manuel, I just want to say thank you for coming to assist this commission and to give evidence. You were in government for many years, and you were in the structures of the governing party for many years. I have no doubt that you could assist this commission, maybe not just about the issue relating to Mr. Mbalula, but also in regard to other issues that we might wish to ask you about. So I really want to say thank you for coming. As you may be aware, I have been appealing to past and present ministers and directors general who may have information that could help the commission in terms of its terms of reference to come forward and assist the commission. I'm very grateful that there is a number of ministers who have come forward. We've had some the former DGs also coming forward, but we wish that there should be more, because it's difficult to think that only those who have made contact with the commission know things. One thinks that there are many, and there are many present and past ministers who have a lot of information that they know, and government officials, but they simply haven't come forward, including members of the governing party who should know quite a lot of things. So I really thank you that you have made yourself available.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think we're all vested, as South Africans, all vested in the success of your mission. So we wish you every strength and success as we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bashe.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Mr. Manuel, you have before you just one volume, one bundle of documents that run from TAM 02 to TAM 41. You have that?
I have that, thank you.
If you look at page TAM 02, I'll actually, if you don't mind, cut out the TAM appellation part. I'll just call the numbers. So if you look at paginated page 02 to 016 of the paginated bundle, could you tell the chairman if you recognize this document?
Indeed, this is an affidavit I submitted in October last year.
If you turn to page 04, there is a signature on that page. Do you confirm that this is your signature?
I can confirm that that is my signature, yes.
When did you sign this document before a commissioner votes?
In October, the 11th of October last year.
Are there any corrections or amendments that you would at this point wish to make to the statement? This is the better time to do it rather than as we go along?
Yes, there is a bit of a contradiction that arises from the dates that I refer to when the NEC took place. But that matter is corrected in paragraph 12.
Indeed so.
Thank you.
The documents that are on pages 6 through to 16, what are those documents?
That's an exchange of unforgettable open letters between Mr. Fikile Mbalula and I.
We'll get to them in due course. Do you recognize the document that is on page 18 and runs all the way to page 25? What is that document?
Yes, Chair. That is a supplementary affidavit that I deposed to in February of this year, which deals primarily with the system of appointments of ministers. I can confirm that indeed I deposed that affidavit, and that is my signature on page 25 of the bundle, 8 of the affidavit. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any changes, amendments you might want to make to that particular document?
You know, there is one change, and it relates to the circumstances that prevailed. I think it's paragraph 23 on page 23 of the bundle, and it relates to the fact that it says here that Cyril Ramaphosa succeeded Kgalema Motlanthe as deputy president in Polokwane. That is, in fact, not correct.
Yeah.
What is the correction you wish to make?
The correction there is that Kgalema Motlanthe became deputy president at the conference in December 2007.
That
Cyril-
is in Polokwane.
Sorry?
That is in Polokwane.
In Polokwane,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Thank you. No further changes?
No further change.
Thank you. Rule 6.5 of our rules requires that I establish whether any of the evidence contained in the October 2018 and the February 2019 affidavits has previously been placed before any other commission or tribunal or court or body. Has it?
No, I can affirm, Chair, that this evidence appears before this particular commission for the first time.
And
Thank you.
just in explanation of that, if that were the case, we would then have had to find that transcription so that we could look at that evidence with you.
Appreciate that.
Then last but not least, could you please turn to page TAM 27 through to 29?
Yes.
And then if you keep your finger there, if you could then look at TAM 30 to 41.
Yes.
Have you seen these documents before today?
I've seen it in the bundle, and it relates to an affidavit from Mr. Gupta.
It is the application that you had opposed
Yes.
about a month ago.
Yes.
This is just to say that we will be placing some of those facts into evidence. Well, we will be asking you about some of those matters that are raised there. To go to matters of a little more significance, Mr. Manuel, you're a person who has had vast experience, as the chairman has pointed out, in serving in a democratically elected government. Are you familiar with the report of the Public Protector, dated 14th of October 2016, and which is titled State of Capture? Only familiar, not that you've read it cover to cover, Mr. Manuel, but are you familiar with it?
I can confirm both. Thank you.
In fact, the cover page of that report explains that it is, and I quote, a report on an investigation into alleged improper and unethical conduct by the President and other state functionaries relating to alleged improper relationships and involvement of the Gupta family in the removal and appointment of ministers and directors of state-owned enterprises, resulting in improper and possibly corrupt award of state contracts and benefits to the Gupta family's businesses, close quote. Mr. Manuel, as a result of that report, this commission, of course, has been tasked with investigating the matters that Advocate Madonsela investigated. You would agree that the untoward appointment and dismissals of members of cabinet fall squarely within the Commission's remit?
I have no doubt it's front and center of the Commission's work.
Various witnesses have given evidence on state capture in particular, as well as fraud and corruption, but the focus that I want to hone in on today is state capture, because the Commission is interested in what you may identify as key issues in state capture. But to give you a bit of context, Mr. Manuel, I've come across an open source media report where the SACP has referred to state capture, amongst others, as a term used, and I quote, to describe private interests influencing the state's decision-making processes, close quote. Then in the May 2017 South African State Capacity Research Project's paper entitled Betrayal of a Promise, How South Africa is Being Stolen, close quote, they refer to state capture as a concerted effort at repurposing the state and diverting rents away from development in ways that are extra-legal and anti-constitutional to the detriment of the South African public. I've really paraphrased what they have to say. Then finally, Mr. Manuel, we have had two experts, American professors, Drs. Hellman and Kaufman, who appeared before the Commission. Dr. Kaufman actually appeared in person, and they defined state capture as, and I quote again, the efforts of individuals or firms to shape the formation of laws, policies, rules, and regulations of the state to their own advantage by providing illicit private benefits for public officials, close quotes. Essentially, they say to us that state capture is a form of corruption, and one that is distinct and more invasive than administrative corruption, which is the more common form of corruption. Having given you that background, Mr. Manuel, can you share your views on this subject matter of state capture? And in particular, as I foreshadowed earlier, are you able to identify key issues in state capture that really should be preeminent in the mind of the chairman as he wades through the evidence that will be placed before him whenever all of that evidence has been placed before him? Are there pointers that you can share with the Commission?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My understanding of our Constitution is that it vests responsibility, executive authority in the President, acting with Cabinet. There's no higher authority. And in the context of trias politica, I think even the courts have been reticent to try and determine how the President should conduct himself. Now, in respect of the appointment of ministers, for instance, the Constitution doesn't give anybody else the authority to do so. And in the context also of the oath of office of the President, which is a very public oath, there's a commitment to act within the interests, to do everything in the interests to advance the Republic and to oppose that which may weaken.
And
it also asks
faithful
for the
to the
dictates of
Republic.
conscience.
And to be faithful to the Republic, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
And to be faithful to the Republic. And in this context, I mean, I think that the judgment by the Constitutional Court on the 31st of March 2016 found that the President had violated his oath of office. Now, if we take oaths and we are cavalier in their implementation, I think it's the beginning of issues relating to state capture. And you know, it's something that I think all of us as South Africans should be deeply concerned about, because if those words lose meaning, then the conduct can't follow. When I go back to a number of judgments, for instance, it's very clear that the court wouldn't enter into the terrain that is occupied by the legislature either. And so there's no higher authority. And we must look to the dictates of conscience as the oath requires to ensure that you will have the proper execution of what is required of people who occupy high public office. Now, in this regard, I think the issues that arise, Chair, about the appointment of ministers is exceedingly material. Who knows who's consulted, who breaks the news, and how is information shared, I think is signal to a range of other issues about the conduct that is before this Commission. Thank you.
In fact, Mr. Manuel, if I might just contextualize what you have said, in particular with respect to the President and what the Constitution requires of a President. I'd like to just go through Section 86 of the Constitution, I beg your pardon, 83 of the Constitution, which reads as follows. The President, A, is the head of state and head of the national executive. B, must uphold, defend, and respect the Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic. And C, promotes the unity of the nation and that which will advance the Republic. So there really is a duty on the President to ensure that what he and the national executive that is appointed under his direction and at his will, because he believes that people who can progress the mandate that he's been charged with. The President must ensure that in what he does and in what the national executive does, the interests of the Republic must be advanced. And that really is what you've talked to us about. But can I go a little beyond that, Mr. Manuel, because this Commission has, of course, heard evidence from various witnesses, some of it which will still be challenged, I believe, at some point. But if I might just point you to the PFMA, which I believe is one of our most significant pieces of legislation, and one that you had just about everything to do with. You drove it through the whole legislative process. Can you just very briefly speak to the critical issues that that piece of legislation sought to ensure this democracy would take account of, that this democracy would embed? And these are all the types of checks and balances that the drafters and the legislatures at the time, the legislature at the time, sought to ensure would advance the interests of the Republic of South Africa. Just very briefly speak to us about that piece of legislation and, of course, all the Treasury notes and regulations that go with it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gabashi. Mr. Chairman, when we drafted the Public Finance Management Act, which is Act 1 of 1999, there was a fundamental shift from the old norms that applied in the Exchequer Act. And what we sought to do in the PFMA was to recognize the parity of decision-making across systems, the three spheres of government and the systems that apply. And the focus was on outputs and responsibilities. What the Exchequer Act did was to construct a treasury that kind of gave individual permissions, and so you had a kind of rules-based bureaucracy. And the big shift, and I think it's in line with what we raised earlier about the interpretation of the responsibilities of the head of state, the head of the executive. It requires people to act in the best interest, and the words used in the PFMA at various points would be utmost care. And so that shift is fundamentally important. It's drawn, the essence of the PFMA is drawn from Chapter 13 of our Constitution, which sets out norms for budgets, for budget control, for the management of finances, for the issuing of guarantees, and a range of similar kinds of issues that would be normal in fiscal arrangements in democracy. And so it's for that reason that the Public Finance Management Act was greeted in the way that it was. I should point out that as it matured probably a few years later, there was some resistance from people who argued that it holds up. But if you look at the link again between the PFMA and the Constitution asks that one of the tests be that there is value for money. And I make the point now, I can expand it, that when there is reckless spending, almost inevitably people who are dependent on public services, the poor, are denied access to services because the controls are not in place. And in a context of state capture, it's actually an endeavor to remove those kinds of controls. And I think it's that we must take a very serious view of, because the measure of what happens is actually seen in the lives of very poor people, children who still don't have school buildings, children who die in pit latrines. It's that kind of issue that happens when the controls are loosened because there isn't due care and attention as required by the PFMA. One of the other issues in the PFMA relates to certain schedules that apply in respect of state-owned enterprises. Schedule 2, for instance, takes account of large, significant state-owned enterprises, Eskom, Transnet, SAA, Denel, those kinds of enterprises they're all listed in that schedule. And part of the difference between that schedule and the next schedule is that the deeming provision to bring these bodies into Schedule 2 is that they would be well managed, that corporate governance norms would be adhered to, that they have strong balance sheets and can manage their affairs and be accountable for the management of their affairs in the public space. And I think that the collapse that we've seen with a number of state-owned enterprises in the last decade or so reflects the fact that the powers given to these state-owned enterprises were exercised without the necessary care and attention to detail. And so it's that. I'm saying the PFMA is distinguished from its predecessors by the fact that it recognizes and distributes responsibility to groups of equals.
I'm glad that you mentioned SOEs in particular, Mr. Manuel, because I've always grappled with the distinction between an SOE and what was converted to an SOC, and the underlying rationale for doing that. I know you're part of that policy making that sought to convert what might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, the predominantly developmental role of an SOE to a more commercial role for SOCs. But I might have this completely wrong. Can you just take us through that?
Chair, this isn't an area that I'm expert in, but my sense of it is that the nomenclature referred to state-owned enterprises for a long period, and when the Companies Act was amended, they were termed state-owned corporations. In essence, they're the same. The big distinction in the PFMA is the schedules. The first, Schedule 1 applies to all manner of bodies, including the Chapter 9 institutions, for instance. Schedule 2 has a long list of entities, and I referred to some of them before. Schedule 3 refers to some smaller state-owned enterprises. And Schedule 4 has a very diverse list, including supported entities such as universities and so on. But it's Schedule 2 that we look at because I think the bulk of issues, Chair, that relate to state capture actually can be found in Schedule 2.
Yes, thank you. Maybe as just a last question in this part of the evidence you're giving, are you able to identify one or two institutions that are particularly vulnerable to state capture? And really, this is an open-ended question. If you're not able to, so be it. But if you are, it would just help to illustrate the point that you've been making this morning.
Chairperson, it's a fundamentally important question, and from the many state-owned corporations, let me highlight what I see as the position of Eskom, and I think it's a situation that is well canvassed. Eskom, in its history, was an exceedingly strong institution, one of the top utilities in the world. Eskom had a stronger credit rating than we had as a sovereign, and we would look to Eskom with a sense of jealousy about the fact that they could borrow more cheaply than what we could. Eskom also, of course, had surplus generating capacity, and 6 power stations were mothballed. And then changes happened. And I think that if you looked at the situation in the last decade, all of that has come apart. Now, I'm sure that this commission has and will continue to receive detailed explanations of how things go wrong. But when I try and understand the role of Eskom in the public domain, firstly, South Africa's industries were built on available, cheap sources of power. That's no longer there. We've moved up the ranks of the cost of energy. We were also able to use surplus power to extend electricity to the homes of many millions of very poor South Africans who previously, because of apartheid, had been excluded. Thirdly, having available electricity with predictable prices meant that we could build a further industry and invite investment into our country. And then, of course, Eskom, managing off the strength of its balance sheet, didn't impose a burden on the fisc. Not for cash injections, or neither for cash injections, nor for guarantees. All of that is gone. And if you look at the position of Eskom now, and when I referred to the budget tabled in Parliament by Minister Mbeki last week, it's clear that Eskom sits as an albatross around the neck of the fiscus. And so Eskom has to be supported. I think none of us as South Africans can ever entertain the idea of allowing Eskom to go down. But having it means that we increase the burden of debt in the general economy. Also, if one looks at the applications of Eskom to NERSA, the costs of energy into the future are not as predictable as they ought to be. But moreover, I think that as the state takes on more and more debt, the credit rating suffers. And when the credit rating of a country suffers, and if we run the risk of losing our investment grade rating, it means that as a country we have to borrow at much higher costs. Now, the budget last week proposes a deficit of 4.5% to GDP. That money must be borrowed. And if the costs of those borrowings increase, the ability of the state to provide services to people is diminished. It's seeing the interconnectedness of this. And when I look at the events which are very well canvassed in the State of Capture report by Advocate Madonsela, it's clear, Chairperson, that there was a cavalier attitude in the management of this. I think there are a series of other issues as well. In the last few years, in the last decade, in fact, Eskom had 12 CEOs, 6 chairmen, 60 directors, and 30 executives, and between them, they cost 514 million rand. So if decisions are taken with a focus on short-termism for the benefit of private individuals, then I think the costs are borne by all of society, but those most vulnerable bear a greater proportion of the cost, and I think it's that we must understand about Eskom. And similarly, if you looked at Transnet, and you look at the way in which the supply chain management was managed on the acquisition of locomotives and wagon systems, then you begin to understand that the costs, because part of what Transnet has to do through freight rail is to manage major exports, the coal line and the iron ore line. And when you place the costs of that prohibitively outside what is competitive in the global system, I think we weaken the economy progressively. But similarly, given the fact that we have Gauteng as the industrial heartland, far from the seaports, managing that in a system of freight rail is also something that needs to be taken with a lot of care, and the essence of those words in the PFMA of due care needs to be felt in the management of these kinds of systems. So I think that the examples of the impact of state capture are legion in this country right now.
So when the SACP speaks to the taking of decisions that deprive South Africans of the resources of this country, that really is the essence of what state capture can be considered to be.
I concur entirely. Chairperson, it's felt immediately, and I say you can look at education, health, social services at one level. You can look at the deteriorating state of our infrastructure at another. And then you can look at the poor spending that we can do as a country on economic infrastructure, the kinds of things like special economic zones and so on. If our abilities are diminished, then we aren't going to create the employment, and we also then impose a burden on future generations. And of course, state debt is always a price for future generations to pay. So it's a very serious matter.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel, for those insights. It might be best at this point to move on to the primary reason, really, that the Commission wrote to you and asked you to come through to assist it. And that is your recollection of what transpired at the NEC meeting, an ANC-NEC meeting of August 2011. But it might be more convenient, Chairman, to preface that discussion of the NEC by just looking at the broad area of appointments and dismissals. So in this regard, I'll ask you to turn to your February affidavit, Mr. Manuel. and recount or just summarize your experience of the practices or conventions that were followed when you were appointed to cabinet. At paragraph 2, you state that you've always understood that the power of the president to appoint cabinet ministers is a constitutionally protected prerogative, and that cabinet ministers serve at the pleasure of a sitting president. Please just expound on this proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Bash. Mr. Chair, it's one of the powers given to the president that has no fetters. And I think that in the experience of those of us who've served under different presidents, we would have seen the exercise of that power. The first president I served under was the late Nelson Mandela. And the first government we were part of was a government of national unity. So that reality, I suppose, fettered the freedom that the president had, but it was clear that there'd been consultation between, he was then just president of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, and some of the senior leaders who were about, including the late Walter Sisulu and others. And so after the announcement of election results, but before he was even inaugurated, there were a number of positions that he indicated he'd secured.
Can you pause just there? He indicated it secured, indicated to whom,
okay,
when, and why were those particular persons selected?
I'm saying that it was on about the 9th of May 1994. And historians can check the date of the election results and the date of the inauguration of the president. And we had convened in the National Working Committee of the ANC. There were a number of positions, including the fact that the position of deputy president would be shared between Thabo Mbeki and F.W. de Klerk, that the position of foreign minister would go to Alfred Nzo, that the position of defense minister would go to Joe Modise, etc., etc. And I was also on that list as Minister of Trade and Industry. It seemed that in the discussions also between the three parties would constitute the government of national unity, these positions had been settled. And after the inauguration of President Mandela on the 11th of May, there was still some negotiation about some positions. But that's what happened then.
And at the time, of course, we had the interim constitution that was in place.
We had the interim constitution that applied until we adopted the constitution in May of 1996. Would you like me to continue?
Please do, please do.
Then, after some weeks after President Mandela had been inaugurated, he called me, as was his style, at 4 in the morning, asking me to see him as soon as I could in the morning. I happened to be in Cape Town and had to get an early flight, but that was, that's just by the by. And when I got there, then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki was there, along with fellow Minister Tito Mboweni and Deputy Minister Ali Kawa. And the President told us that Derek Keys, who'd been our first Minister of Finance, had asked to be relieved of his responsibilities, and that he needed to find a new Minister of Finance. He felt that the country wasn't ready for an ANC Minister of Finance yet. And then put the proposal that he wanted to bring in his banker, Chris Liebenberg, as Minister of Finance. He wanted to test this with this grouping of people who, in his view, were in government and understood matters economic. And he then proceeded to invite Chris Liebenberg. And Chris served, I think, for about a year before he indicated to Madiba that his time was limited. And so in August of 95, I was invited to the office of the President, where again I met then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki. The President said to me that Chris Liebenberg would be leaving after he tabled his budget, and would I be ready to serve as Minister of Finance? And asked for the views of the Deputy President, and we agreed, and on that basis, President Mandela asked me not to disclose this to anybody. Now, I mention that because the oath of office has been consistent that ministers in taking the oath commit not to disclose information in their possession to anybody not entitled to do so. And there was no disclosure. It was on the 28th of March 1996 that President Mandela, well, shortly before that, about a week or so before that, the President called me again and told me that I would get a new deputy minister in the person of Jill Marcus. And and that the position that I'd occupied as trade and industry would go to Alec Irwin. And he gave me permission to have a conversation with Jill Marcus. And on the 28th of March of that year, in Parliament, President Mandela made the announcement that Jill Marcus would be the Deputy Minister of Finance, I would move across, Alec Irwin would become Minister of Trade and Industry, and Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka would become his deputy. Those were some of the changes that he announced, and there were others relating to the closing down of the RDP office, the dropping of Paulo Jordan from Cabinet, and the move of Jay Naidu from the RDP office into communications. That happened on that day, and we were sworn in so that I became Minister of Finance from the 4th of April 1996. That's what happened then, and there were no changes. 1999, in the way...
Before you get to 1999, Mr. Manuel, I'm sorry to interrupt the narrative, which is important. Can I just interrogate one or two issues? The one point you make, and I think it's in paragraph 3 of your affidavit, is you speak about the norm. I'm just giving you the term out of context. Either at this point or maybe you will want to deal with this later. My question really is, is there such a thing as a norm in the appointment of members of the National Executive? And I really am looking at the manner in which President Mandela, in light of the Government of National Unity, had to handle the appointment of members of the National Executive. But can you say that anything in the manner in which he dealt with appointments would have constituted a norm that other presidents may have wanted to have regard to?
It's a complex question, Chair, because norms and conventions require a much longer period. But I think what President Mandela did was to put in motion a trend that is true to the spirit of the Constitution, that vests the responsibility with the President.
Responsibility for what, Mr. Manuel? Just to be very clear.
Sorry, responsibility for the appointment of members of the executive. Bear in mind that the executive exists in the Constitution and in life in two parts. On the one part, there are cabinet ministers, and then, as the Constitution says, the President may draw from members of Parliament and appoint them as deputy ministers to support the system of governance. That too is a responsibility And of course, the Deputy President is appointed by the President in quite the same way. But those are presidential prerogatives articulated in our Constitution.
The second aspect you touched on with respect to the appointment procedure followed by President Mandela was the issue of confidentiality, both in relation to the manner in which he spoke to the persons he had selected as members of his cabinet, but also in relation to how those members who had been selected needed to treat the information that had been imparted to them. So my understanding of your evidence is that that confidentiality, not publicizing discussions, either by the President, with the President, that way of doing things, that manner of doing things, was critical to upholding the gravitas of the office, to securing the interests, if I might just default to that phrase, the interests of the Republic of South Africa. It's really the confidentiality of those discussions that I'm drilling down into.
Chairperson, that is fundamental. I think it's also important to see that in the context of ensuring that the releases of information are symmetrical to anybody who's interested. Asymmetry of information, especially in respect of matters of government, will actually be used by certain players, I would imagine, to hedge and take positions on all manner of issues. So it's not just confidentiality for its own sake, it's also recognizing the importance of the exercise of power by the head of state, because you can't, I think it would be completely cavalier to allow for arbitrage opportunity. Excuse me. And I think that if you look at a situation that applies later, in December of 2015, it seems very clear that there were people who knew that a particular individual, quite out of the blue, was going to be appointed as Minister of Finance and somehow became advisors even before the individual was sworn in. That demonstrates a break with that norm, with that tradition that is so fundamentally important in ensuring that confidentiality is actually uppermost in the exercise of that power.
Maybe I should allow you then to deal with the next period, which starts in 1999, just before we get to the tea break. And that's the appointment process you experienced under President Thabo Mbeki.
Thank you. Chairperson, the elections in 1999 were held, I think perhaps end of May, early June. The President was inaugurated on the 16th of June of that year, President Mbeki. A number of us received requests to be at the State Guest House late that evening after a cultural event. Kind of sensed what it was about, and there was a large gathering of many people who'd been ministers, were ministers, because, ministers remain in position until a new cabinet is appointed as per our Constitution. And there were some new individuals in this large room. It had never, there'd been no process like that before, and so we all kind of sensed what it was about, but didn't know how this would be exercised. And individuals were then called into a study. I was, I think, perhaps the second person to be called that night, and President Mbeki was sitting there with Kgalema Motlanthe, who was then Secretary General of the ANC. Very briefly, I was asked whether I'd continue I'd be prepared to continue serving as Minister of Finance. When I agreed, they both thanked me, and I was asked to leave the study for the outside and to go home, not to have any contact with the rest of them, and I went home. It so happened that I shared a house with the late Kader Asmal, who then changed from Minister of Water Affairs to Minister of Forestry. He came in many hours later. And I had no inkling of the change until he woke me very rowdily, I would say, to tell me that he was very happy with the new assignment that he had. But that's how that happened. We were sworn in on the following day. History would probably reflect on about the 17th or 18th of June. That's how the position remained. Essentially, there would have been some minor reshuffles, I would imagine. Between then, that's June 1999 and 2004, when there is yet again an election.
Can I ask you just to pause there for 1 minute and explain to me what your interpretation of the presence of Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe, who was the Secretary General of the ANC at the time, what your interpretation of his presence in that study with President Mbeki was. How did you view that?
Thank you. Chairperson, my understanding of it is that the President would never arrive in the position purely on the strength of his own or her own jacket. Ours is a party-based system, and if you look at the proportional representation system, I think the president in party is actually the genesis of taking responsibility. As we know, the president arrives in Parliament to be sworn in as a member at the convening of the first Parliament after an election. And if there's then an election by Parliament for the President, who's then relieved of his or her responsibilities as a Member of Parliament. So the President is very much also of the party that wins an election. So with the Secretary General present, my understanding has been that there would have been some consultation. Now, when I say some consultation, I'd indicated that when President Mandela announced to us, it was in the National Working Committee, but subsequently, it was never at so large a forum. Clearly, it could not be in the National Executive Committee, which is exceedingly large. It's about 80 plus people. I would hazard, Chairperson, that each of the members of the National Executive Committee would see themselves as a prospective minister, and so you couldn't negotiate this thing. Yet there needed to be some consultation. So without knowing for sure, I would guess that it may have been with the top 6. President's preferences given to the top 6, and then the Secretary General representing those interests when an individual is invited to serve as a minister.
Thank you, and I've been reminded that it's almost tea, but if I can just wrap this up with one last question, Chairman. What I understand you to be saying is that you would essentially subscribe to the view that in selecting members of the National Executive, a president makes a political judgment on how best to deliver on the mandate of the majority party. Hence, that, however informal, consultation with senior members of the party.
That is certainly my interpretation. I think just for the record, Chair, there were also people brought into cabinet during that period who were not of the ANC. Nkosi Mangosuthu Buthelezi was brought in as a minister from the IFP. Musibudi Mangana was brought in as a minister, but was president of AZAPO. So those things happened as well, but I'm sure there would have been consultation, because almost inevitably, there may be some people who would, in the ANC, would think that those individuals occupy their position. So the political preeminence of the head of state being able to explain how they weigh the balances, I think, is a fundamentally important part of that. Thank you.
And what that person considers best serves the interests of the Republic, obviously, would inform this process.
Yes, yes, Chairperson, I read it in the context of the oath of office, to do that which advances the interests of the Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. Chairman, maybe this is an appropriate time to take the tea break.
Okay, we'll take the tea adjournment, and we will resume at 11:30. We adjourn.
I'd said that there were significant changes introduced at the ANC conference in Polokwane in 2007. One of the consequences of that was a very intense discussion at an NEC meeting in September of 2008, at which a resolution was adopted to recall President Mbeki. And one of the first actions I took very early in the morning, it was a Saturday morning, perhaps the 20th of September, I went to my office in Pretoria to have a letterhead, and I tendered my letter of resignation to President Mbeki, and I delivered it at about 7:30 in the morning. I went off, the NEC meeting continued, and I gave a copy of that letter to both President Zuma, who was then president of the ANC, and President Kgalema Motlanthe, because it was clear that the ANC would support his candidacy to become president of the Republic. They tried to persuade me to withdraw my letter, but I was very clear that my reading of the Constitution is that ministers serve at the pleasure of the President. The assumption, of course, being that the pleasure is properly and carefully utilized. As it happens, I indicated to then Minister Motlanthe that if he required my services, I would be available, but it had to be his call. Couldn't be the call of a predecessor. As it happened, I had to fly off to New York and Washington for international responsibilities I had. Whilst traveling from New York to Washington, as it happens, my phone rang off the hook because my letter of resignation had been leaked to the press in South Africa, and the rand appeared to be in free fall. But I returned on the public holiday, 24th of September. That evening, Kgalema Motlanthe called me and asked if I'd continue to serve as Minister of Finance, and he would invite me after he's elected the following day. It seemed to be a procedural formality that he would be elected. And so that was a different set of circumstances. There were some ministers who resigned there, and replacements had to be found, some rather hurriedly. And a new cabinet was formed and sworn in as the cabinet of President Motlanthe on about the 25th or 26th of September of 2008. And that cabinet remained in position until elections the following year, and the same routine was followed. When President Zuma then had been inaugurated, an invitation to the State Guest House, then a much larger grouping of people invited. And perhaps I was lucky to be first or second again invited to serve. And in the room, in the study, were President Zuma with Gwede Mantashe, who was then the Secretary General of the ANC. So I'm saying that in my mind, the initiative to confer with some of the top leaders of the political party seemed to be entrenched by that practice. We were sworn in and sorry, I need to interrupt this. There was something that happened. You see, Chairperson, when you're invited to become a member of Parliament, to have your name placed on a list of candidates for a party, you are required to sign an acceptance, a nomination acceptance, and to the best of my knowledge, it still exists in all political parties. So I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back after the 2009 elections. So I delayed, and then I was called Tulu Tuli House by, and had a meeting with President Zuma and who wasn't then President of the Republic, and Gwede Mantashe. And I indicated that that event I referred to was a signal that my persona had become too intertwined with the portfolio of Minister of Finance. It wasn't good for democracy or me. And President, Jacob Zuma then indicated to me that he was mindful of it, and said that he would ask me to do something else in cabinet, not Minister of Finance, but it would be inappropriate to discuss it because there would be asymmetry. I accepted that, signed the acceptance form, went through the motions, sworn in, and then I was invited to serve as Minister in the Presidency responsible for the National Planning Commission. And that was a position I occupied until the end of that term, which was in 2014. But I think, Chairperson, it's appropriate to mention that there were significant changes in the way in which these things were exercised. For instance, at the end of October of 2010, there was a very large reshuffle. There were 10 ministerial changes in all, and 7 ministers were dropped from cabinet. And when one looks at it, well, try to understand it then, but when one looks at it in retrospect, that word that was used by Advocate Gabashe, quoting a report earlier, the repurposing, seemed to be at least one of the factors considered. When one looks, for instance, and I'm going to use an example, Chair, Barbara Hogan, who testified before this commission, had been Minister for Public Enterprises. On that day, the 31st of October, she was summarily dropped from her position, and Malusi Gigaba was appointed as Minister for Public Enterprises. And you can run through the entire list that reflects a series of choices that were exercised along those lines. And, you know, for instance, Minister Molewa was removed as Minister of Social Development. Minister Batabile Dlamini was brought into cabinet for the first time. So those changes were there, and those changes, I think, have had a profound impact on the norms of governance since then. There's a person I see in the room, and I'm not supposed to see him, but I know that he was also summarily dismissed on that occasion as part of the repurposing.
In fact, that new cabinet, and I should actually rephrase that, the persons who were appointed both to cabinet and the deputy ministers who were appointed ended up constituting the largest cabinet stroke appointment of deputy ministers we've ever had in South Africa, in terms of just numbers.
Numerically, I mean, this thing exploded. Cabinet, the executive exploded, because apart from, from 2009, there were new positions created. What used to exist as minerals and energy was separated. What used to exist as trade and industry, 2 new portfolios were created, economic development and small business. there was a new alignment of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, etc., etc. So there were significant changes in 2009, and I think that the cabinet wasn't rapidly expanded, even at that occasion in 2010 I referred to, but virtually for every position there was a deputy minister, and in some instances, 2 deputy ministers. So I'm saying repurposing, but of course, there's also always an opportunity for patronage when you expand a function in the way that it happened over that period.
Well, may I interrupt you,
Of
Ms.
course,
Kabashi,
Chairman.
just to say, will the legal team make arrangements that we obtain that full list of how the cabinet was constituted before that reshuffle in 2012 that Mr. Manuel is talking about, and obviously how it looked like after the reshuffling? I think it may be quite important. We should just have that list, and then obviously the legal team and the investigators must apply their minds to what evidence, if any, may be necessary around that. Okay.
We will do that, Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Manuel, the point you really touch on now is that the Constitution provides for a rational application of its provisions, and that includes the appointment of ministers and the appointment of deputy ministers. You would agree with that?
I agree with it entirely.
So one of the key factors that the chairman can certainly look at as he ultimately, at the end of this, of all these hearings, looks at appointments and dismissals, is use that rationality standard to interrogate whether a particular national executive.
Well, before Mr. Manuel might answer that, and he is free to answer it, I just want to advise him that this may be a legal question, so that if he chooses to answer, he can answer, but if he thinks it might be difficult, he is free to do that. Yeah, okay, all right.
Then I'll just rephrase it and just say rational standards are what is expected in terms of the Constitution, and leave it at that.
Yes, and Chair, you are absolutely correct. I think there has to be the test, the objective test for rationality in the exercise of power.
Can I ask you just very briefly to then just explain the significance of a ministerial portfolio as opposed to that of a deputy minister? Because we are ultimately going to come to a position where we're discussing the change in status of Mr. Mbalula from being a deputy minister of police to being a full minister of sports and recreation. There are people who still confuse the concept of deputy minister and assume that deputy ministers are members of cabinet. Maybe coming from you, people will understand this differentiation a little better.
Chair, my experience and my reading of the Constitution is that Section 85 of the Constitution vests the executive authority in the President, and it's exercised with other members of cabinet. So presumably you have to be a full minister. You may be assisted, but in the main, ministers can't devolve their responsibility to deputy ministers. So it's always been, well, before '94 there was a clear distinction, because there were some deputy ministers, and ministers had loos in their toilets and deputy ministers didn't ever. They had to continue to try and get there. They were referred to in Afrikaans parlance as kortbroek ministers. That was the distinction before 1994. And so I'm saying Section 85 vests the executive authority in the President acting with Cabinet. And it was always a bugbear for deputy ministers because when ministers were away, there was always a requirement that an acting minister be appointed, and this must actually be in a presidential minute. And the acting minister has to be a member of Cabinet. So deputy ministers never become acting ministers. I think the distinction made in the Constitution is held in practice. And I think it's quite an important distinction. In fact, in the case of the Ministry of Finance, because of the extraordinary workload, one of the functions that the Minister of Finance has to deal with would be variations to import tariffs. Now, these things come in at the rate of about sometimes 30 a week. And it was just an unbelievable workload, and I approached President President Mbeki, then asking him whether we could separate this out and the deputy minister could be assigned this. So there had to be a formal assignment, right, by a special presidential minute, and the publication of that power in the Gazette. So it wasn't just the Minister of Finance sort of shoveling work to the deputy minister to keep them out of trouble. There was actually a formal assignment of that responsibility. And I think that's how the Constitution provides for the distinction.
Yes, indeed, you're correct, because the Constitution does provide in Section 98 and 99 for any temporary assignment of functions to go from a cabinet member to another cabinet member. So if it were to go to a deputy minister, indeed, a special proclamation, some legal document,
yes,
in terms of Section 101 again of the Constitution, would have to be put in place. Can I wrap up this part of your evidence with the following question? Is there anything fundamentally wrong in a president taking advice in circumstances where he or she does not abdicate his or her authority to take a particular decision? I ask this because part of the area we're going to move into now is the 1.3, term of reference 1.3 area, where we're talking about whether anybody in an unauthorized manner was able to get information on an appointment process that the then president was busy with. So the question is there anything wrong really with consulting, never mind who, but just the process of consulting a third party, if that president does not abdicate his or her authority to take that final decision?
Thank you, Mr. Bashi. Chairperson, I don't think that there can be an objection to consultation. What I've tried to indicate from my experience was when I was appointed, the Secretary General of the African National Congress, who was not a member of Parliament even, was in the room, indicating that there had been consultation. I'd never known any, which is why I would have to guess if the top 6 were consulted as a unit. Because there was never, I didn't see the Treasury General of the ANC having a press conference and saying, well, you know, this president wants to appoint Trevor Manuel. I disagree with that. It was always kept in the strictest confidence. And I think that the issue of consultation would require that. It would require, I think, also an interpretation of the oath of office of the head of state. What advances the interest of the Republic? And I look to you, Chair, and say that when I read the judgment of the Constitutional Court, 31st of March 2016, and at paragraph 83, where it deals with the violation of the oath of office, it's about those kinds of things. It's about whether these matters are, whether the powers are consciously exercised and the limitations understood by those who exercise that kind of power.
Yes, thank you. This really takes us to the meeting of August 2011, and it brings us to the October 2018 affidavit that you deposed to.
Yes?
Maybe I should start at the beginning. What triggered Mr. Mbalula's outburst at the NEC meeting of of August 2011?
Chair, I may be slightly wrong about this just because of the lapse of time.
Yes.
But I'll try and put my recollection, and I think the next witness may be in a position to confirm or vary that.
Yes.
But my recollection of that NEC was that there was a tense discussion about the influence of the Guptas.
Can I ask you to pause there, because I know you're going to go further. When you say the influence of the Guptas, a tense discussion about the influence of the Guptas, was this not the discussion introduced by Mr. Mbalula, or did that tense discussion ensue after Mr. Mbalula had made his contribution?
Chairperson, the African National Congress is a political movement, and politics is very wide, and wide-ranging discussions take place in the National Executive Committee. And so, in response to what started out as a political overview provided frequently by the president of the ANC, there then is wide-ranging discussion. And amongst the issues not canvassed in the introductory paper, but that emerges from the floor is, but why are the Guptas as influential as they are? And then there'd be various comments on that. There's no resolution on it at the conclusion of the discussion, Chair, but it's quite important that these matters were raised as freely and as strongly as they were in that National Executive Committee meeting. And my recollection of it is, Chairperson, that when it came to the opportunity for Mr. Mbalula to speak in that meeting, he became very emotional. In the exchange of open letters between ourselves, I referred to his weeping, and he said he cried, but I didn't understand why he cried. And I'm saying it was a very emotional thing. I'm not saying this to in any way try and humiliate him or anything. It was an exceedingly difficult emotional issue for Mr. Mbalula, my interpretation. And it was about the fact that he'd served, before this reshuffle I referred to, the 31st of October 2010, he was serving as Deputy Minister of Police. Maybe it was called Safety and Security, maybe Police, but he was Deputy Minister there. And on the 31st of October, he was announced as the Minister for Sport and Recreation, and thus moving from a deputy minister into a cabinet position. Now, what he articulated in the NEC was that he was very excited. No, he said that he was called to Saxonwold to be told by the Guptas. Now, I know that there may be a difference of names, maybe Atul, maybe Ajay, maybe he knew them, maybe he didn't know them. I would not be able to distinguish between one and the other brother because I don't know them.
If I might just clarify, Mr. Ajay Gupta, who is the older brother, says he had the discussion with Mr. Mbalula. It was not Mr. Atul Gupta who you reference in the statement. But that's really just
That may be so, but
information.
if I read his affidavit, Chair, he also says that it was in Midrand at the offices of Sahara, whereas my recollection of what Mr. Mbalula said in the NEC was that he was called to Saxonwold. And I would assume that he knows the geography of Greater Johannesburg well enough to know the difference between Midrand and Saxonwold.
Can I add one more area of dispute as you continue with your narrative? The third one is that Mr. Ajay Gupta says he simply congratulated Mr. Mbalula and said he understands Mr. Mbalula is going to become a full minister.
Well, Mr. Kabasha, I wonder whether you shouldn't allow Mr. Manuel to finish his recollection of what happened in what Mr. Mbalula said and what happened at the NEC meeting that is relevant to what we are dealing with before. Then maybe you put that to him.
As you please,
Yes,
Chairman.
just so that the evidence is continuous, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. What Mr. Mbalula said was that when he was called to Saxonwold, he went there, and there he was told that he was going to be appointed as Minister of Sport and Recreation. And he was at first very excited about making it into cabinet. I mean, there's a sense of a big promotion. Very excited at being told this. But in retrospect, and this was the emotional part of it, it should never have been the Guptas or anybody else who told him that. It was the prerogative of the president, and that prerogative had been violated by the way in which the information had been shared with him. Now, I think, Chairperson, that if and when Mr. Mbalula does appear in this commission as a witness, he's likely to confirm what I'm saying. That it was the sense of the violation of the constitutional prescripts in the exercise of authority by the president that had been violated by somebody who knew before he was entitled to, and seemed to suggest that he had sufficient power to confer the status of cabinet minister on an individual. That's the big issue, and I think it goes to the heart of what I earlier described as repurposing and extraneous influences, which also seem to align with the terms of reference of your commission, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. If I might just ask one or two questions relating to this particular narrative. First, my understanding from your evidence is that Mr. Mbalula's contribution at that NEC meeting did not trigger the discussion on the influence of the Gupta family, or the perceived influence of the Gupta family on the president. It was in response to a discussion that was already in place, or that was unfolding, that he then made his contribution. I don't know if you can recollect that kind of detail. It would be useful if you could.
Chair, with respect, I don't recall it. It may have been something along the lines of a group of members of the National Executive Committee starting to argue that the president doesn't exercise full control. And then it sort of develops into a particular discussion. It may have been something along those lines, but I couldn't confirm at this stage that it was Fikile Mbalula who sort of who triggered the entire discussion. I think there was a discussion happening that arose from a concern about extraneous influences on the exercise of power.
So, is my understanding correct that while because of the lapse of time you might not recollect certain aspects correctly, but you have no doubt that there was at that meeting some discussion around concern, the concern that was being expressed or had been expressed about either the influence of the Gupta family in government, or that the then president was not controlling certain things properly. That part, is that part one that your recollection is clear about, or not really?
No, Chair, I think your reading of what I'm saying is correct.
Yes.
In fact, at that time, there was a climate where it seemed as though certain individuals were invited to Saxonwold. Not only Minister Mbalula, but he was the first to make that declaration, and it's almost a public declaration because the NEC comprises of more than 80 people, of how he'd been appointed. There'd been speculation about a number of others and a bit of banter even about whether somebody was a Gupta minister or whatever. But this was the first, to the best of my knowledge, the first confirmation which was in the form of I'm saying a very emotional statement by then Minister Mbalula about how he'd been appointed. So it broke, in many ways, it broke the taboo, it broke the myth, it confirmed that these things were actually happening.
It's interesting that this is a discussion that took place in August of 2011. Mm-hmm. The appointment of Mr. Mbalula was in October, effective 1st of November 2010.
Yes.
Almost a year later is when you had this discussion at the NEC meeting. Are there events that may have unfolded between the 1st of November 2010, when he was appointed Minister of Sport and Recreation, and the August 2011 date that sparked this discussion?
Chair, I don't want to subject this commission to my conjecture.
Yes,
because I mean, in the form of these discussions in the NEC, and I hope I'm not breaking any confidences, but it generally starts with a political overview provided by the President, and then discussion. And discussions are generally free-flowing, and they'd be supportive of the views, and sometimes there'd be opposing views. They never come together, they never result in formal resolutions. But I think it is an opportunity to clear the air, to try and persuade others of positions held. And so I don't actually read anything into the fact that there wasn't an immediate reaction in November of 2010. Perhaps it took some time for the matter to actually gestate just in the minds of some people there.
I would then go back to my term abdication of authority and say that the essence, therefore, of that discussion was about the President being influenced by a family to the extent that he appeared to abdicate his authority to take critical decisions that the Constitution confers on him and him alone.
Chair, I have not the slightest doubt that that abdication is in evidence in the example, but I would hazard that if you take many of the state-owned corporations, the ministers, I used the word repurposing. The ministers who were appointed to particular portfolios, part of the exercise of their power was to recommend to cabinet certain appointments at state-owned corporations, enterprises, same thing. I think that they acted frequently to advance certain positions. You could only, Chairperson, arrive at a situation where ESCOM lived through 12 CEOs and 6 chairs in a decade. If the repurposing was the objective. And so I have no doubt that if there were reluctant ministers, they'd be removed and replaced with people who were more pliable. I want to say that I don't have the slightest doubt that that's what transpired with the removal of Minister Nhlanhla Nene on the 9th of December 2015 and his temporary replacement with Des van Rooyen, who arrived with advisors in tow, and if my reading of Advocate Madonsela's report is correct, had spent previous week visiting a particular house in Saxonwold every single day. When I say repurposing, it's my reading of those kinds of circumstances that shape it for me. Somebody who is reluctant in performing certain functions, then being replaced with somebody who might act quite differently and receive instructions from strange places.
One small little matter, just to confirm. At the NEC meeting of August 2011, you confirmed that the President of the Republic was present.
The President,
as President of the ANC. He was there.
Yes, indeed,
Thank
Chairperson. He was there.
I just wanted confirmation of that.
He was there. I mean, it's perhaps it's just the way I am. If Advocate Gabashe in this environment said something, she cast judgment on something I'm doing. I may actually say, with respect, Advocate Gabashe, I fundamentally disagree with your view on this matter. I wouldn't leave it, but that's just how things are.
Was there a reaction from the President?
I certainly don't recall any reaction.
I would then like to take you to the issues that Mr. Ajay Gupta raises in his Rule 34 application and the statement next to that. And I'll really just set them out, paraphrase them briefly.
Mr. Bash, what's happening?
You're
getting a lot of assistance.
My learned leader thought you were preparing to ask a question, Chairman.
Oh, no.
And he knows that I don't stop talking until I'm asked to stop. he was just asking me to pause for a second.
I didn't intend to, but certainly there was a question in my mind, so that part he read quite well. There was a question in my mind, but I'm not going to interrupt you for now.
Thank you, Chairman. The first issue really is that both Mr. Mbalula and Mr. Ajay Gupta assert that it was Mr. Ajay Gupta who had the discussion and not Mr. Atul Gupta. My question really is, does anything turn on which Gupta brother had this discussion with Mr. Mbalula?
Chairperson, I don't think anything turns on it. I think the admission that there was a discussion is sufficient to confirm what Mr. Kabashe refers to as a sense of abdication. I know that in this open letter, I said it was Atul, or did I say Ajay?
Yeah, I think
but
You said
Atul,
Atul,
yeah.
Mr. Manuel.
Yes, but you know, that may have been what I thought I heard, but because I don't know the individuals, I don't think that I would ever attempt to distinguish between one or the other, and I don't think it's material. I think the fact that there's an acknowledgement that ahead of Minister Mbalula's appointment, that there was a discussion about the fact that he would assume a particular position, because there's also a sense argued by Mr. Ajay Gupta that he didn't say it will be Minister of Sport, but that you would go into cabinet. I think that's immaterial. How did he come by that knowledge? I think is an important question.
I will get to that point in a minute, but can we just clear the issue of Sahara computers in Midrand and Saxon World? Your recollection, and I really am just placing this on record, your recollection is that Mr. Mbalula said he had been summoned to Saxon World.
Chair, I don't think that I could assert the word summons or summoned. But certainly he was called to Saxon World. That is my recall of what he said.
The next area of dispute is whether Mr. Ajay Gupta, this is his version, is correct when he says he simply read media articles and realized that Mr. Mbalula was up for promotion and wanted to congratulate and did in fact congratulate Mr. Mbalula on his appointment to full minister. He denies in his affidavit mentioning the portfolio of sport and recreation. Is that your recollection of what you heard?
Chair, it's but my recollection over a long period that Minister Mbalula said that he'd been advised that he would assume the position. Because it would not be an unreasonable expectation for somebody who occupies the position of Deputy Minister, say of international relations, to aspire to occupy the cabinet position. It would not be unreasonable, but where you have a kind of diagonal move where there's no evident skill set. I think it's worth recalling, and that is certainly what Minister Mbalula or Mr. Mbalula seemed to suggest about the engagement.
Of course, if you look at paginated page 35, which is one of Ajay Gupta's annexures, and you go down to 3/4 down that page, it's a FIN 24 archives report. It reads as follows. The weekend Argus reported that Deputy Police Minister Fikile Mbalula was set to take up a full cabinet post as a reward for leading the campaign that saw Zuma elected ANC president in 2007. This is what Mr. Ajay Gupta's version is. He says a full cabinet post. He did not mention sport and recreation. Again, if you look at page 37, again, it's an annexure relied on by Mr. Ajay Gupta. The top paragraph, again, speaks to taking up a full cabinet post as a reward for leading the campaign that saw Mr. Zuma elected ANC president in 2007.
Of course, Mr. Kabashe, we have to remember that Mr. Manuel wasn't there when there was that conversation. He only knows what, on his recollection, Mr. Mbalula said at the NEC. So he probably might not be able to say what Mr. Ajay Gupta may or may not have said to Mr. Mbalula, but what he certainly did here is what Mr. Mbalula said at the NEC meeting. So I just mentioned that, but you might be wanting to say something, Mr. Manuel.
Chair, I mean, you know, press speculation will always obtain. I would imagine that ahead of the elections on the 8th of May and subsequent to the announcement of results and so on, the press will speculate Ranjani Munsami would put together a cabinet. It's just the way this thing works. But if Mr. Egypt there sees his name in Ranjani's list, it would be quite extraordinary for me to call Mr. Egypt and say, well, congratulations on your appointment. Why would I do that? What authority would I have to do it? And I wouldn't just call him on the telephone. I would invite him to my home to do it. And I think that gives the entire exchange a particular meaning. And you know, my reading of it is, if you have the authority to call somebody to your home to break that news, unless he was going there for general shebeen activities, but if he were called to the house to be told this, then there must have been a sense of authority and perhaps expectation from one side about how this would pan out.
Even if you were called to Sahara Computers in Midrand,
I think
the same would pertain.
The same issues would apply.
In any event, I really am just putting Mr. Ajay Gupta's version to you, and that version is contained in his statement, which you'll find on page 30 and 31, paragraphs 4, 5, and 6 speak to the issue that those newspaper reports speak to. So really, this is just the Commission's effort at saying to you, Mr. Ajay Gupta may not be here, but he has given us a version, and this is what his version records.
Chairperson, I'd like him to be here. I'd like him to give up the hiding place in Dubai and be here and face consequences.
Yes.
With respect to those media reports, when Mr. Mbalula addressed the NEC meeting in August, he certainly did not make, and this is a question, did not make any reference to what he might have read in the October editions of various newspapers, which are the ones that Mr. Ajay Gupta relies on. This is a question.
Chairperson, it is not my recall. My recall, and I mean, the matter referred to as the emotional breakdown is about the fact that in retrospect he felt violated by being told. So it wasn't that I read in the New Age that I will be appointed Minister of Police and then I wasn't appointed Minister of Police. This was a different kind of exchange that then triggered the emotional response.
Yes. If you would then turn back to TAM, page 4, just above paragraph 11. So we're looking at page 4, and these are the last few questions, Mr. Manuel. We're almost done.
Yes.
I really want to interrogate very briefly the annexures that you annexed to your statement. The paragraph I have a particular interest in is the second one. Well, at the top, really, Mr. Mbalula talks about newspapers that have all kinds of leaks. And this is in his response to you. But it's the very next paragraph that I have a particular interest in. If you would please read that into the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bashe. And I quote from an open letter from Fikile Mbalula, which is dated the 11th of June 2017. And I quote, "Manuel did not understand what my tears were about. He did not get the point then. I'm on record as stating that I have fundamental problems with the way capitalists operate, and the Gupta family show us just how ugly capitalism is. Indeed, they abuse privately learned information to try to position themselves somehow. I was not about that, which is why I was the first to report this to an open NEC. I am still not part of that. I do not stand for that. On the other hand, Manuel was one of the people who at that NEC meeting did not agree with my stance on the Gupta family," unquote.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. So the first part of that paragraph speaks to Mr. Mbalula's what he calls his fundamental problems with the way capitalists operate. Was this the sense you got from his contribution at the NEC meeting?
Chairperson, I would really have to stretch the point to think that Mr. Mbalula was taking an ideological point against capitalism. I don't think that was articulated in any shape or form. Because, you know, there's a general capitalism, and then there's the behavior of the crudest kind of rent seekers. Now, I think in the minds of many, the Guptas would be categorized as crude rent seekers. And so, but, you know, to the best of my recollection, Mr. Mbalula wasn't articulating an ideological point. He was upset about the exchange and as we referred to earlier, the abdication of responsibility by the head of state.
Thank you. The second part of that paragraph is the very last sentence, which reads, "On the other hand, Manuel was one of the people who at that NEC meeting did not agree with my stance on the Gupta family." Your comment?
It would be very strange. I mean, I have never had any relationship or any brief for the Gupta family, and I would not in any shape or form, Chairperson, countenance the idea that individuals should be the bearers of tidings to members who are about to be appointed into the executive. It's in total violation of everything that I think the Constitution requires of the exercise of executive authority. Now, when you have an NEC of 80 people, and generally no time limit on how long people can speak for, the fact that another person doesn't speak on the same topic doesn't mean that they disagree with the view articulated. You would only know that if, you know, I saw Cheryl Carolus here earlier. She used to, we served, oh, she's still here. We served in the NEC together. I would never know what her views were on a particular matter unless she articulated those views, because this is not something that, I mean, the NEC forums are not arranged so that each of the individuals can articulate a view. So, I mean, this is trying to, I think it's an attempt by Mr. Mbalula to distinguish himself as pure as driven snow, but I mean, you know.
Well, in your letter to Mr. Mbalula that we have here, that to which he responded in the Daily Maverick, I think, you raised the issue of what he said at that NEC meeting in a certain context, and he responded in the manner in which he responded. But am I right to say part of what you are saying here about what he said at that meeting is that he was expressing an objection to being told by somebody outside of government, being told by one of the Gupta brothers that he was actually going to be moved from being deputy minister to being a minister. Am I correct to say you are saying he was objecting to that as you understood what he said and what his crying was about?
Chairperson, let me just try and couch it in an understanding I have of the
Yes,
circumstances. If Atul Ajay, what's the other brother's name? Tony? Rajesh. If any of them were to phone me and ask me to come and see them at home, I don't think I would go. I've never been called, so I don't have any grounds, because it's not a resolve that's been tested in any way. But if you don't have a relationship, why would you go there? Whether it is Saxonwold or the Sahara Computers offices in Midrand, why would I go there? And in the course of the exercise of executive authorities, you have to meet business people and so on. But it's always very important to do certain things, as I try to do. If a business person wanted to see me, I would ask them to indicate in writing, and almost inevitably I'd ask that the meetings take place in my office. And so I'm saying, for me, the context is important. If you didn't have any relationship, my question would be, why did you go? What was said to you as part of the invitation to go to wherever that exchange took place? And I think that it's fair to presume a pre-existing relationship. And so, Chairperson, the open letter I write is kind of to say to Fikile Mbalula, don't pretend that you had no relationship because you wept tears about this issue. And I'm trying to signal that there was a pre-existing relationship of whatever form, because I wasn't privy to it.
Well, there may or may not have been a pre-existing relationship, but he spoke at the NEC meeting. And I'm just trying to try and understand, to check that my understanding of what you are saying is correct. Let's assume there was a pre-existing relationship. He's crying and he's raising this issue that he had been told for the first time by the Guptas that he was going to be made minister before the president could tell him. From what you have said, I understand that he was unhappy about that, about the fact that he was told by the Guptas before the president could tell him. Is my understanding of your understanding of his attitude incorrect?
No, Chairperson, I concur with that view. The question, though, is the one that Mr. Kabashe asked earlier. If those events took place in October of 2010, it was a very long gestation period before the remorse was felt. Because the essence of it is, he was at first elated at being told that he's now made it into cabinet. And then in the cold light of day realizes that there was something wrong with the way in which he was communicated with and by whom. So if there were signals of early remorse before that particular NEC meeting, I wasn't privy to them.
Well, part of what I'm doing is because the approach would be where he or anybody expresses a view that is a good view or takes a position that's a good position, you know, it may be that you give credit for that, but where he or anybody takes a wrong decision, a wrong position, you deal with that and say, but that was wrong, but that was right. Now, so I'm trying to see whether from your evidence, I can say that he expressed unhappiness in the NEC that a situation had arisen where the Guptas knew in advance that he was going to be made minister, and he was saying, this is wrong. Or at least part of what was saying, whether part of what was saying was this.
Chairperson, you know, as Mr. Mbalula says in his response to me, that he was the first person to make such a declaration in the NEC, and I would grant that point to him. The recognition of something that was fundamentally wrong, even though with the lapse of time, I think is an important point. Because if the corridor speculation around the cabinet room and the NEC was correct at the time, there were also a number of other individuals who'd been called in the same kind of way and have never made a similar declaration. Yet, Chairperson, if the work had been done as the former public protector did in a report of communication and presence, because the GPS on our telephones would tell us who's in this room right now. If those things were done for a number of other individuals, I would not be surprised if others were told at about the same time by the same individuals about the positions they'd occupy. And you know, because, Chair, for me, it speaks to, on the one hand, the abdication of power, and on the other hand, a very public expression of power. Supposing, and you know, it doesn't happen, but supposing a president were to ask for my ear about a particular appointment, I don't think that it would ever be my place to communicate to the individuals that we discussed. It's not my place. And unless we can conduct ourselves correctly with the confidences, I mean, I go back, Chairperson, and some of this is learned behavior. When President Mandela said to me, all right, so I'm going to appoint you, but don't go and discuss this thing with anybody. It's what you accept. I mean, I think if you accept that you will serve in a cabinet system, you must abide by the rules. And if outsiders come and demonstrate in a boastful way that they have access to information that they're not entitled to, then I think it speaks to the violation, which is at the center of an inquiry into capture.
Well, I will allow Ms. Kabashe to continue and finish, but after that, I just want us to have quite some conversation about some of these issues, because one, they are very important. Two, you served for a long time in government, and you have a clear understanding of how government works and cabinet and so on, and you were in the NEC for a long time too. So I would like us to discuss that. But just to go back to the issue of what it is that you understood Mr. Mbalula to be raising or to be crying about in the NEC, it's important, and you have indicated that you would grant him that credit in terms of raising that issue, being the first one to raise that issue. It's important because in this commission, I have had Mr. Jonas, who came here and gave evidence, and I know that there may be a challenge to his evidence. He might still be cross-examined, and I will make a decision later at some stage, but he gave evidence that was to the effect that he was offered a position or was of Minister of Finance by I'll say just the Guptas. I think it was one of the brothers, and he rejected it outright there and then. So you might then have a situation where Mr. Mbalula might not have raised any concern necessarily to the Guptas when they told him, but maybe that it wasn't an offer. They were just telling him what they understood to be what was going to happen. As a matter of fact, that he was going to be made minister. But then he, on a certain understanding of his evidence, of what he said, he then raises it at an NEC and says, this is what happened to me, and therefore brings it to the attention of the leadership of the governing party for them to know what has happened and then take it from there. But I'm just mentioning that I think once Mr. Kabasha has finished, we will have a chance to talk more about these issues. Thank you, Ms. Kabasha.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one or two more questions. Mr. Manuel, if you go to page 3 of the paginated bundle to your paragraph 9, which is part of this exchange, this open letter that you wrote. That's what I want to focus on. The very last sentence of the extract reads, perhaps there are still a few debts to be called in by Saxon World. Could you explain what you were communicating in this sentence?
Chair, the vituperative of open letters are the creative juices generally of about 3 a.m. I go back to the way in which I try to answer the question put by you, Chairperson. I'm saying that my reading of it was that there must have been a pre-existing relationship. That's the gist of this. And a pre-existing relationship, relationships can be based on all kinds of things. Perhaps they are just general friendships. Mr. Nyanda over there and I are friends, and we meet occasionally, and we have a chat, and we've been friends. And that would be, he doesn't need anything from me, and I don't need anything from him. It's just a friendship. But the sense that I have of the way in which the Guptas have interacted was never about the need for friendships. It was the need for favors. And it's in my reading of that word of repurposing. Chair, let's go back to the portfolio that Fikile Mbalula was promoted into. Sport and recreation, to replace a person, the Reverend Makenkesi Stofile. And the late Reverend and I had been friends and comrades for many years. His involvement in sport was lifelong. When as early as 1981 we tried to stop a Springbok tour to New Zealand, it was to the Reverend Makinkesi Stofile that we turned to go and campaign because sport was his life. So you take somebody who is a committed, active sports person in his youth, active sports administrator as he grew a bit older, and you replace him with somebody in that portfolio who has no visible or known experience of participation in sport, apart from, as we've seen, flying to a Mayweather boxing match. You replace a person who has reached into the sporting fraternity, because that's what's important about a portfolio like that, with somebody who has no evident communication with the fraternity. These are actually important issues, and so it's against that backdrop I ask if there are still some outstanding favors to be called in.
In that context, there's an open source report I came across that suggests that Mr. Mbalula was actually supposed, or the intention had been to appoint him as full Minister of Police, and that for some reason somebody put the spanners in the works, my words, not the article's words, and he was then moved to sport and recreation. My question is this an issue that arose at the NEC meeting of August 2011, which is what you are dealing with today?
No, Chairperson, it didn't arise. But let me just infuse into the question. My understanding of what you said may be a legal matter, the rational exercise of power. And you know, with cabinet positions, because they are itinerant, you don't necessarily have somebody who has all of the schooling in a particular portfolio. But to Ms. Kabashi's question, I don't know, and you know, you're not meant to know, if that speculation in your open source is correct, what the criteria would be to evaluate that he might be an appropriate candidate to occupy the position of Minister of Police. Perhaps it's that he fears nothing. Perhaps there's some other gift that he has that we are unaware of. But, you know, all I'm saying is that it's fundamentally important to look at how power is exercised in a rational and objective manner.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. Can I ask you to look at page 15 of your paginated bundle? At paragraph 2 thereof, page 15, this is what Mr. Mbalula writes in response to your open letter, and I really am only interested in the first sentence. He says, I have asked before, where were all these people when Trevor Manuel appointed or accepted R.J. Gupta as Cabinet Advisor on Economy and an ambassador of Brand South Africa during his term? I just want to focus on that and nothing else. What do you know about this particular allegation?
Chairperson, in terms of Cabinet advisors, Cabinet doesn't have advisors. Ministers have advisors, but Cabinet doesn't have advisors. So the position of cabinet advisor from somebody who was a cabinet minister, he should know that it's a non-existent position. So why he dredges up something that doesn't exist, or attempts to dredge up something that doesn't exist, I don't know. It's a question that he might be in the best position to answer. The second issue that he draws attention to is that he served as an ambassador of Brand South Africa. I think the term ambassador is used very liberally. Now, to the best of my recollection, when Esopahad was minister in the presidency, one of the responsibilities he had was for Brand SA. And generally, ministers have the license to approach cabinet to appoint people onto boards. And in this context, I don't know if it's Ajay or Atul, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of these brothers, one of the Gupta brothers certainly served on the board of Brand SA. I do want to make the point that I have a sense that when the Gupta brother was appointed, very little was known of their activities, and if there were nefarious activities, they were certainly not in the open. Chairperson, in my limited experience, there are people who were public servants whilst I was a minister, for whom I had high regard for their conduct and integrity and diligence, and who later emerged, for instance, in the Madonsela report, but I didn't know them in that way. That happened in the fullness of time. And my sense is, though I had no personal relationship with Guptas, as I've said before, having somebody who has arrived in South Africa, appears to have a network of contacts and can assist in brand building would have been the motivation by a minister. But it's not an ambassadorial position. It's serving on the board of Brand SA. So to try and inflate the position as something that cabinet would have dealt with and handing over diplomatic passports and that kind of thing could not be further from the truth.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Manuel. The remainder of the annexures that you have relied on, I do not think are particularly relevant to term of reference 1.3. And unless you can point to some relevance in that discussion that will assist this commission decide the question of appointments and dismissals and the influence on the decision maker by a family or by unauthorized persons, I will pass on the rest of the content of those two annexures. I don't know if you think there are particular issues you want to draw on in those two annexures that you believe are relevant to the reason that you are here today.
No, there's nothing else, Chairperson. I mean, I've mentioned in passing that the notion of repurposing, and I have made reference to the appointment of Desmond Royan, which is common cause, and his arrival in the Treasury with advisors, which I think may have been evinced there as evidenced by, amongst other people, Mr. Lungisa Fuzile, because all of that speaks to the same kind of cavalier use of power, I'm afraid. So, it's because the trends set in, and it's quite important to understand that. Thank you, Chair.
My very last question, Chairman, is really an open-ended one to Mr. Manuel. Are there any other matters that you would like to bring to the attention of the chairman, even if they are matters that don't fall strictly within the preserve of term of reference 1.3, but there may be matters that you would want to come back to the Commission to explore because they are matters that are germane to the discharge of the mandate of this Commission?
Chairperson, there is nothing at the moment. But, you know, I am willing to make a commitment under oath that I would do whatever I can to assist with the success of the mission given to you to deal with state capture. I think all of us as rational South Africans need to be invested in the work that you're doing. We must try and ensure not only that the evidence becomes public, but I think that it's very important that there be consequences for those who were involved in wrongdoing. Those who have wittingly been instruments of corruption and state capture need to be brought to book, and the role of this commission, I think, would be paramount in ensuring that justice is seen to be done on that matter. So in whatever small way I can assist, Chairperson, I want to give you the assurance that I would. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Manuel. Chairman, I have no further questions for Mr. Manuel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Manuel. I did say that I still wanted to have an engagement with you in regard to a number of issues that are very important. But before we look at how to handle that, I'm mindful of the fact that your statements, both statements, may have given the impression, they certainly gave me the impression that we might take a very short time with you, and we have taken much more. And you may have made traveling plans that might be disturbed if we keep you for longer. So I just want to check how your situation is in terms of being around a little longer.
Chairperson, having just declared my commitment to avail myself to the Commission,
Yes.
I'll have to stay here. I couldn't otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we might have to go into the lunch hours just so that when we release you, then we are done. Is that fine with you?
I'd appreciate that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. May I take my seat?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. As I have said on a number of occasions before, this commission, in terms of its terms of reference, must, among other things, investigate allegations of state capture. And whether or not those allegations are well-founded is something that I will decide much later. But should I decide that indeed those allegations are well-founded and that there was state capture, one of the things that I will have to look into is what recommendations I should make with regard to measures that may need to be taken, to be adopted to try and make sure that state capture never happens again in our country. And in order to deal with that question, I have to look at, in part, I have to look at how did state capture happen? How did it start? And how was it allowed to go on for X number of years? And that question includes looking at the question of what organization or what structure of government or who could have had an opportunity to contribute to having state capture stopped as quickly as possible? What could they have done? And if they didn't do it, what were the circumstances? So it seems to me one would have to look at all of those things in order to make very informed decisions or recommendations. Now, I then want to hear what your views are in this regard. With regard to, well, maybe I should start by saying, as far as you know, when did the NEC of the governing party become aware that there seemed to be what everyone now calls state capture? And if you are able, you can just talk about how you understand they might have come to be aware of that. And it may be that you are not able to say as to when they became aware, but you are able to say generally your view is that by a certain time, many people within either the NEC or the ANC had become aware that there was something happening which should not be happening, that we have come to call state capture.
Thank you, Chairperson. The question you pose is a difficult issue because my own reading of the situation, and a lot of this is with the benefit of hindsight, of course.
Yes.
Is that the period, President Zuma was president for 9 years. In the first 5 years, it seemed as though at some point the institutions of government, because if one reads the literature on state capture, then the role of institutions is always fundamentally important. And those institutions across government are very wide. And if you look at the institutions of the criminal justice system, for instance, remove the judiciary, because the judiciary has held up amazingly well, and they've got a Judicial Services Commission, et cetera, that could, in some way, fetter the powers to appoint whomsoever the head of state likes. But if one looks at the rest, if you look at, I know I'm mindful of the fact that the Mokgoro Commission is sitting as we speak,
yes,
but if you look at some of the events that transpired in relation to the National Director of Public Prosecutions, then there was clearly stuff that happened there that weakened the institution. Now you can track back. You can track it back perhaps even into the previous administration, and then look at the particular appointment and look at the subsidiary appointments. You can look at the police service, and you can look at some of the occupants of the position of National Commissioner and some of the heads of the particular branches. And if the police is rendered ineffective and the prosecutorial authority is rendered ineffective, then the fact that there would be consequences for wrongdoers diminishes rapidly. So I allude to that big cabinet reshuffle of the end of October 2010. Now, you've asked the evidence leaders to find the extent of the changes and so on and so on. It would be useful to look at those kinds of issues. And ask whether there were particular kinds of actions because of because of changes of ministers. And some of the changes, I mean, you know, you lay the basis over a period of time, and some of them may actually only have been triggered after the 2014 election. You could also, in a not dissimilar way, look at some of the state-owned enterprises or corporations. I mentioned the number of CEOs of ESCOM, for instance, and you could look at the boards of these state-owned corporations. Could the boards exercise governance over the management appointed? In senior executives of the organization, at what point did they start changing their behavior? At what point does somebody trained as an engineer who understands generation, at what point do they start changing, and what is the inducement for change? I don't know the answers to these questions, Chairperson. You could similarly look at Transnet, you could look at SAA, you could ask why it is that particular individuals were preferred to occupy certain positions in boards or in executives. And you're probably going to find, Chairperson, that if you paid very careful attention, if there were research done on the timelines of behavior. Now, at ESCOM, we had power outages perhaps as early as 2008, when there were certain challenges that arose, if my memory serves me, at the nuclear power station at Coburg. They were remedied. ESCOM seemed to be able to deal reasonably effectively with a period of significant growth in the economy. The economy in that period was growing at about 4.5% to 5%. And because we live in an energy-intensive industrial country, the demand for electricity grew. And ESCOM could accommodate the increased demand, and then certain things happened. And when those certain things happened, certain skills were lost. Even employment for particular kinds of experts appeared to become almost impossible. They were driven away. And I think that the timelines across even just the state-owned corporations are going to be very different. But I have no doubt that in the appointment of certain persons to perform functions, be this as chief executives and chief financial officers, be it as technical officers, I think of PRASA, for instance, or be it the ministers that gave license to certain things. If I were to try and map this, that is certainly where I would look. And the one thing I've learned in the past while is that some of the footprints and fingerprints that are left by things like emails and so on don't lie. And so it should be possible, Chairperson, with appropriate expertise to begin to synthesize some of those things. And then you could say, well, if I'm looking at, say, PRASA, I know that it may not be the subject of the Madonsela inquiry. At what point did certain changes happen? What I'm aware of now is that the ability of PRASA to act as a reliable, safe, affordable commuter rail system for working people in this country is very seriously diminished. At what point did it happen and why? I mean, all I can offer you, Chair, is that that kind of analysis would be key to unlocking. And if that were the case, at what point did it happen, and what may have been the chain of command that gave the license to bad things happening?
But in terms of when the NEC may have become aware that there were things happening that we now call step capture, are you able to give an indication as to say, well, by a certain time, surely, you know, most people were aware and therefore they should have been aware, or are you not able to?
Chairperson, I know that one of the ongoing discussions and debates in this country would be the role of party and state. And the role of party in state.
Yes. Actually, that's where I'm getting into. Well, maybe let me finish before, because you have raised it before you answer. I would like to know what your views are about whether the governing party, once it became aware of what we now call state capture, whether you would expect that it ought to have taken some steps to try and make sure that no further damage was done by state capture to the country, to the state, or whether you take the view that, well, there's a difference between the state and the party had, it could not do anything. I would ask also the question, so you could think about it, you could deal with it as well, whether Parliament, with its obligations of oversight, of course, which has got, members of Parliament, whether you think once they became aware, whatever their time is, they also should have or may have had to take some steps to try and make sure that state capture didn't cause any more damage to the country as it may have done by that time. So, and I know that some of these questions might not be easy questions. You might not have prepared to deal with them. So just feel free to deal with what you are able to deal with and to answer what you can. But your views might be very helpful because of the experience you have had both in government.
Thank you, Chair. Let's start with your question about the National Executive Committee. I think that the election to the National Executive Committee is always on the basis of seeming popularity, and the choice of the 4,000 to 5,000 delegates who assemble once every 5 years is quite material. There is a process, of course, that starts with branches and goes through regions and so on to produce lists of people. But of course, there are also slates within it. So you may well end up with the 60 members or so who are directly elected, who merely happen to be popular or maybe one side of a slate. And because these events are so fiercely contested, it may overlook skilled people who happen to be on a different slate. It's just in the nature of how this happens. And when the NEC is assembled, I think it's very important not to imbue it with an authority that it's not meant to have. Chair, because you can look at the issues of state capture as described in the State of Capture report. And the kinds of information are expressed in that report by a former public protector isn't information that the NEC would readily have. Because I mean, that deals with a particular set of state-owned corporations, but if you look at some other issues, and let me just pluck out of the air some of the difficulties in the distribution of grants and pensions. And there are many people who would say when individuals in society are so vulnerable, please don't take chances with their access to survival resources. But there's no voice, there's no place that this is articulated. The NEC has committees, but frequently the people who chair the committees and who are most active in the committees are also the ministers. So it's not very good at holding up a mirror to itself. So you need other mechanisms in society. I think if one looks at Parliament then as the second part of your question, Chair, I mean, there are a number of issues where Parliament ought to have acted sooner. Not a secret, because I've expressed it to successive speakers of Parliament. I think our Parliament actually spends very little time dealing with matters. If you look at how parliaments across the world convene and how debates are managed, and you look at the paucity of debate in our parliaments, I think we should be a bit concerned about it. Also, as we prepare for the 6th Parliament from about May, the question of the skill set that obtains there and whether there is sufficient independent mind on a range of issues. Now, I think late in the day I was impressed by the way in which Parliament responded to certain challenges. The SABC, the response to the State of Capture report and the particular look at ESCOM, for instance. And one holds a hope that that could become the way in which Parliament functions. However, it's going to be important that there be consequences. I know that on both of those reports, there were very clear recommendations from the committees put to the plenary of the National Assembly that may have been signal to what the prosecutorial authority and police should have done. It hasn't happened yet. One looks at other institutions, I pluck out of the air also the example of VBS. There's a report, the Mutau report is there and public. And perhaps it's not read by the prosecutors, perhaps the police aren't interested in it, but I get very concerned about this because if we act in a way where individuals who seize power by whatever way can act with impunity, then the vulnerable in society are always punished. And if we go into this matter, Chair, the question is how does our Constitution protect the vulnerable and create the kind of society that's articulated in the preamble to that Constitution? How do you say to South Africans that we take serious the living standards of all citizens and we want to free the potential of each person? How do you do that when we have an education system that doesn't reach people? It's that kind of inquiry that I think, because our commitments made in the Constitution that we adopted in May of 1996 ought to be durable. And you can only deal with them if there are measurements. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, as they say. How do you look somebody in the eye and say, your life today is better than what it was yesterday? Because that's what the Constitution implies. But on other issues, I really, and I've pondered the question, Chair. We've seen the exercise of presidential power in the assembly of cabinets. There aren't always automatic choices. I know that there were people who were unhappy with President Mandela when he appointed me as Minister of Finance because I wasn't a trained economist or anything. So it's not about ticking the boxes for academic success or otherwise. I've said before as well, when we appointed Pravin Gordhan as the Commissioner for the Revenue Service, there was nothing self-evident about appointing a pharmacist to head the Revenue Service, but I think that if you look back at his record in SARS, it is impeccable. So it's a difficult call. And I don't know how you advise in that call. Even the other issue that is frequently debated about political representation, Chair, where some people argue, as the late Van Zyl Slabbert did, that we should have a blended system that also brings in constituency representation, which is the system we have in local government. But even there, the system doesn't provide the answers we're looking for. But my own sense is that the state capture issues should in fact trigger, and hopefully it's the kind of stuff that you can do in your report, trigger a wider discussion about how we exist as a nation, what matters and what doesn't matter, from people purporting to be religious leaders to children who murder a man in the street to all kinds of issues. There's something wrong in society, and it's because it appears as though there are no consequences. And so the word consequences has to have a particular weight in this judicial inquiry that looks at what went wrong in the functioning of government.
You may or may not have been still serving in the NEC when, according to Mr. Ramatlodi, the NEC, or maybe not the NEC, but some members of the NEC raised the issue, according to him, with the former president of his friendship with the Gupta family. Mr. Ramatlodi said some of the members of the NEC raised the issue, and he said not once, he said many times, and said to the former president, why do you not terminate this friendship with this family? Because, I'm paraphrasing now, it's not good for the party, it's not good for the country or for government. And he says that the former president's answer was something along the lines that this family had helped, I don't know whether his family or helped his children when nobody else was prepared to help them. And as I understood Mr. Ramatlodi's evidence, the matter would end there. And so my question is whether that was ever raised when you were still a member of the NEC, and my a question that arises from that also would be how the NEC would think that that was an issue to be left there if this friendship, as far as they were concerned, was doing a lot of damage to the country or to government and maybe to the party as well. So you might not have been there, but there is this evidence that we had, and I don't know if you are able to say anything.
Chair, these kinds of issues were raised by members at various points. I would hope that one of the results of this commission would encourage deep introspection. I'm saying that whilst the exchange of letters between Fikile Mbalula and I appear to suggest a state of war between us, ultimately, as I said, we're on the same page, and I commend him for having been the first to publicly raise that, the influence of the Guptas. And now the issue was raised, but I'm saying the introspection that's necessary is, what do you do? What should the NEC do when it observes that there's wrongdoing? Is it just left to the personality of the individual who occupies, or the individuals, perhaps the top six? Is it just left to their personality? Or should there be approaches? Because part of politics is also persuading. It's not always about the formal disciplinary processes. The ANC has formal disciplinary processes. There's a National Disciplinary Committee and a National Disciplinary Committee of Appeals, and so on and so on. That's very formal. But the key issue, I think, in a political movement has always been the value systems. And how do you work at that continuously? Because if somebody was good once, how do you help them along the line if in the mind of General Nyanda, I was politically okay when we first met and I veered off the path? Does he have the means to raise this matter and help me back? What's in the mind of an organization like that? I had big fallouts about particular matters, and I was declared a free agent, but be that as it may, I won't go there now. In membership-based organizations, I think there has to be an ethos and a platform of values that binds people together. In the exercise of power in government, Chairperson, there would, in my mind, be two areas where the capture has happened. The first would be supply chain management, the procurement system. And my own sense, in retrospect, and Kabasha gave me accolades for having worked on the PFMA, I'm compelled to ask whether the PFMA, which is based on outcomes, to try and move away from this kind of rules-based system, wasn't designed for people who would always act together in common public good, and we don't find ourselves in a rather strange position where it's been grossly abused. Should the PFMA be tightened up in certain areas? So that's the one side of what I see as risk. The other side is the employment of people. Now, from 1994, there was a mammoth task to work for representativity and the development of skills in the public service. And so I think it would be understood that there may be certain shortcuts, But some of what has happened where people who have no competence and even less interest in the positions they occupy have been appointed, you're on an incredibly slippery slope, and that might be an area where there might be an excursion into how you deal with these matters. And the last point I'd raise in this regard, Chair, is black economic empowerment. I know that we need to retain BEE to ensure that we can have a more inclusive economy and greater participation. I know that the Constitution requires of us, in the Bill of Rights, at Section 9, it allows us to tweak and to favor by discriminatory measures people who've been historically disadvantaged. And so that is the constitutional premise in my mind for having BEE, but it has to be rules-based. And so these are issues, and because we've started the journey, and some of what you'd be told about what has gone wrong in state capture is that it was just BEE. I think that the measures are actually too precious for future generations to allow to be abused. And so, you know, if Ms. Van Leeuwen and I set up a BEE partnership to sell airplanes to SAA. Neither of us, I don't know about her, but I don't know much about airplanes. But we would add a premium onto what SAA can purchase airplanes at. Somebody's got to pay for it. The economy pays for it. That's very different, Chair, from encouraging individuals who've been historically disadvantaged from entering into industry and so on, and then being able to pursue a growth path. So some of these things, I think, have lent themselves to abuse. And I hope that we can have a discourse, nationwide discourse about how to remedy some of these matters that have created the difficulties that we have. Thank you.
Maybe the last question would be this, but before I put this question, I go back to what you said about ESCOM. You said that at one stage, ESCOM was one of the top entities in the world, and I think you were not the first former Minister of Finance to say that. I think Minister Godan may have said the same thing, either here or elsewhere, and maybe one of the DGs or former DGs of National Treasury as well. And you were drawing attention to where ESCOM is now, if you look at where it once was. And of course, we have to examine the question of how did all that happen? How did we come from up there to be where ESCOM is now? And what needs to be done to make sure that whatever caused that, insofar as it may have been part of state capture, doesn't happen again. So, but I just mentioned that because ESCOM, I think, represents quite an example in terms of an entity that, on your evidence and on what I've heard elsewhere, was an entity that was quite high up internationally, but has had all kinds of problems. But the one issue that I want to ask is with regard to what Parliament could have done or could do, with special reference to members of Parliament. When members of Parliament exercise oversight over the running of government departments by ministers and the president when they look at how they execute their executive functions. There may be times when in the past they may have been called upon to stand up and say this is wrong and there should be certain consequences on a certain minister or a certain president, but maybe they might have felt that their party didn't want them to take that stand. Are you able to throw some light as to whether that's something that may have happened? You were a member of parliament for a long time. That may have happened, because if it happened, it might well have led to a situation where when certain decisions could have been taken, were not taken because there simply were not enough members of parliament who stood for what many would have seen as the right decision to be made. And to the extent that maybe it's in our constitutional arrangement in terms of how people become members of parliament and so on, that you have that tension, if you are able to indicate whether it's something that should be looked at for purposes of making sure that if state capture reared its head again, it was stopped immediately, then you can indicate what you think.
Chairperson, I think that I'd start from the premise that the lives of our members of parliament is actually quite difficult, because they have to do so much without support. If one looks at Congress in the United States, for instance, I think every Congress person would have about 10 support staff who can do the research, who can help them, and so on and so on. And that can happen without a caucus function. Just by the by, I yesterday or the day before, I heard a bit of a discussion on the radio where a member of an opposition party refers to what a member of the governing party said about a matter, and he said, "Man, there's just too much stuff to read. I didn't read these documents." Now, that would be intolerable. So somehow we need to find something that recognizes that our parliament represents, I suppose, what we are as a nation. Skill set and so on and so on. But you can't just leave that to chance, and you don't just need some officials with computers to write speeches for these MPs. We need to equip them to deal with issues differently. I'm pretty sure that if we took members of parliament and taught some things, if we taught members of parliament, for instance, to read, especially those who serve in particular portfolio committees like public enterprises or finance and so on, what a balance sheet is, what it looks like, what the numbers there represent, et cetera, what to look for. And if you were to put out a call to accountants and you went to ABASA, Association of Black Accountants in South Africa, or you went to SAICA and said, can you put members of parliament through a course so that they can see what these papers are when state-owned enterprises report? You might actually get different lines of questioning. I mean, I remain of the view, Chairperson, that, you know, as they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if a delegation of any state-owned enterprise arrive in Parliament, and parliamentarians across the board are asking questions along certain lines, as you saw with the state-owned enterprises inquiry, or with the SABC inquiry in about the end of 2016, then it changes the color of the horse. Then these executives can't just come there with some pretense at Parliament because you can call people comrade, you're going to get away with stuff. I think that we need to empower parliamentarians to deal with issues differently. And I think we need to do the same in provincial legislatures. Chair, it's outside of your terms of reference to look at local government, but I get very scared when I read about a contract to deliver stormwater drains in Nelson Mandela Bay municipality where 12 people have been shot because of disputes of a contract. We can't live according to the laws of the jungle. We must empower our public representatives to act appropriately. And I think that is a responsibility that needs a big and repeated call. And I don't believe that we should now try and change and ask for academic qualifications of people who go to Parliament. But I think we must ensure that there be an adequate investment in time and training to ensure that they're better equipped to do what they have to.
Well, municipalities do fall within our terms of reference as well. They are organs of state.
You may be here for a very long time.
No, that's true. But your answer, Mr. Manuel, relates to matters where somebody might just need some knowledge and in order to be able to make certain decisions. But there are very many issues where even if you don't have to read up any reports or don't have to take lessons, you know what is right and you know what is wrong. If there is theft going on in a particular department, you will see that there is theft going on there. And therefore, as a member of Parliament who must contribute to oversight, you ought to be able to stand up and say, there is theft going on here. This minister or this member of the executive needs to be dealt with in a certain way. So when you look at that, what would you say in terms of the ability to do what is right and not to be conflicted maybe between what your party might tell you and what you might think is the right thing to do?
Chair, let me make 2 points. The first is, when I read the Auditor General's reports, and that's quite important as a kind of flag raiser of issues. There are a number of municipalities, and if I said somewhere between 20 and 30, who for a number of years have not completed any audits. The Auditor General can't audit them because there are no records. Why are there no records? Because it's easier to destroy records than to have a negative opinion. We've tolerated this for a number of years. Surely we must embolden the Auditor General. I know that there have been amendments to the Auditor General Act or the Public Audit Act that allow for actions, but we've tolerated these things for too long. That's one kind of example, and I think similarly there's section 85 and 86 of the PFMA that deals with financial wrongdoing in public enterprises. We need to shore that up. We need to shore up the terms and conditions of the MFMA. And, you know, it's quite important, I think, to be seen to be taking action against people. The other thing that is necessary, and I'm not raising this begging to do things. When I look at any number of people, Chair, when occasionally I turn on the television and I see people who've appeared before this commission, whom I know, whose skill sets I can vouch for, almost without exception, none of us are ever called to help out. Sitting over there, Chairperson, is a retired General Nyanda. We know him from the work he did over many years in exile. We know him of the risks that he placed himself and his family under. We know him as a minister. Why is it that his skills are not called upon as they would be in any other society? And the people we speak of are not people who think that this is an opportunity to get rich, to get a tender. If one looks at former presidents of our country who happen to be in the same party as the ruling party, they can't be persona non grata. Why did they govern in the way that they did? Why did they lead government in the way that they did? What are the issues that go into consideration? I wish that there could be consideration of how it was that cabinets were put together that operated successfully. Why is it that skills are not drawn upon? Is it because of insecurity? Is it because people think if I ask Trevor Manuel what he did there, he might get my job? We can make declarations, we don't want anybody's jobs. But skills that have been accumulated, they're not my personal skills, Chair. I don't have proprietary ownership of the skills I have. They should be put at the disposal of the country. I'm not saying that they are faultless and flawless, but even if it's merely to facilitate discussion with people about what one is seeing and so on, I think more people who've been through the ranks need to be called upon to assist. We can't be enemies. We can't utilize our skills elsewhere. We are South African. We've pledged allegiance to the Constitution, and it wasn't for purposes of getting a job as a member of Parliament or as a minister. It has to be a continuous pledge to the Constitution. And that, I hope, is what we can look at to try and prevent what has happened over the past decade or so, which I think imposes an enormous burden on successive generations.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Manuel. I really do hope that your appearance before this commission will encourage many others who are former ministers and current ministers who can contribute and who have knowledge of matters that fall within our terms of reference to come forward and take the attitude that the issues that this commission is investigating are very important for the nation, and that they would want to be part of those who make contributions to make sure that the work of this commission is a success. Thank you very much. You are excused. We are going to take the lunch adjournment. I see that it's much, much later than I thought we would take, but these were important matters that we needed to deal with. Mr. Pretorius, I see you are up. Do you? Oh, okay. Yes, as is normal. Yes, no, thank you. I think we should take the lunch adjournment. It's now 1:45, and maybe resume at 2:45. That gives us the usual hour. Okay, we adjourn.
Ha ha ha.